as well make a start and pick up from where we left off last time. So we're trying to understand the origins of religion, and here we're talking about the earliest expression, the elementary formation of religion, the earliest expression of religion. So we're trying to understand, study that, right? So the third now theory that we want to reflect upon is nature worship. Now, if we look at nature worship is literally about the veneration of those natural phenomena that we encounter. So the sun, the rivers, the mountains, the sea. These natural phenomena are so great, and we're in such awe of them that we venerate those things, those natural phenomena. Now, it's argued that nature worship evolves according to stages. So there are three distinct stages that lead to the development and the kind of formation of nature worship. The first stage is identification. This is where early humans would look at nature and identify distinct forces embedded within nature. So what we would have is nature would be divided according to the distinction of a particular force. So the sun is not the same as the sea. These are two separate forces within the natural kind of universe. So we identify a particular force, a particular phenomenon, and we recognize its kind of greatness, its particularity, its uniqueness, and its distinction from other natural phenomena. And then what we have is personification. What do we mean by personification here? Yeah.
It's like you make those forces sort of conscious.
Okay, yes.
They do these things on purpose.
Okay, so there is intent behind those forces. Yeah.
As we were saying yesterday, trying to find some kind of not motive, but when we rely on something, and say that the inland farmer creates a fertility god, which was trying to gain control, and through our worship of this thing that has power or is able to do things, then we can help ourselves.
Yeah.
You humanize it and give it like human qualities.
Okay, so there is that element definitely, which we will have to draw upon. So if we look at what essentially the forces that we identify in that first stage are personified, which simply means we assign agency to those forces. So there has to be some kind of intelligent entity controlling the sun that makes it go up, that makes it go down. So in essence, there is a controlling power, controlling agent driving that particular force. So we're personifying it with some kind of divinity in essence. So this is that stage where in essence the forces of nature become transferred to more kind of gods, spirits, deities. So those kind of intelligent beings that control those natural forces that we've identified. So we personify them into those kind of divinities in many ways. Then the next step is the creation of myth. So what do we mean here?
Why or how the personified nature does things?
Yeah, so basically now that we recognize that there is a controlling agent, a divinity that controls the sun, then we give it a name, maybe in Greek mythology, Apollo, in Hindu philosophy, Surya. So what is their backstory? How did they come about? What is their power? And so forth. That whole elaborate mythology around those divine agents is constructed. So in essence, it is that whole kind of acting with intent aspect here. Okay, so we're going to now reflect on Max Muller. Now, Max Muller basically argues that there are 4 distinct stages to the formation of religion based on essentially nature worship. Now, he reflects upon Hinduism. So he says basically the best way to understand the origin of religion and to kind of suggest that it's based on nature is Hinduism. Hinduism is our best glimpse into the origin of religion. Now, why is that perhaps the case?
It's very old and developed over all the time.
So it's over 5,000 years old, so it makes it unique in that perspective that it's one of our oldest living traditions. But also what Muller looks at is he sees the relationship between religious formation and language formation. And he sees that basically in Hinduism we have some of the earliest religious texts still living to this day. So he basically sees that that allows us to kind of understand the origin of religion. Now, it's hard to tell from these images, but these images are trying to depict different stages. Can we see perhaps or name any? It's really hard to tell, I know. So the first picture, in some ways, is personifying elements of nature, like the sea and so forth. Now, I suppose the best way that we're going to go about it is just to break down Muller's 4 stages. So, as I said, Muller believes that there are 4 distinct stages to the formation of religion. The first is what he termed natural religion. So this is the earliest stage of religious thought. This is the earliest stage in religious formation. This is where we first navigate nature. This is where we first encounter nature. And so we are observing nature, and this is our first response, which is often awe or fear or utility, right? Now, in this process of basically recognizing and responding to nature, what makes it quite natural is that this is our first response. This response is spontaneous. This response is instinctual. It's emotional. It's not kind of rational. It's very much built upon that kind of intuitive aspect, a kind of emotional connection that we build with nature. And Muller says at this stage, basically, early humans lack scientific explanation. So we don't know why there is night and day, why the sun goes up and down. We don't know the reason behind those phenomena. So it's just about that connection and having awe or fear or utility around nature. So that is the first kind of step, this natural religion. And Muller also describes it as encountering, or basically it's the sense of the infinite. So what he means by that is this natural world is huge, it's powerful. And so it, for early humans, appears infinite, endless, basically. And so when we are confronted with these natural phenomena, the sun, the river, the sea is huge, it's vast, it's powerful. So in essence, we basically try to make meaning. Yeah. So we as individuals encounter and confront these aspects of nature, and we want to kind of understand it or kind of give meaning to it. And this is where we use language. So we're trying to describe early kind of phenomenon. So this is why, if you reflect, and this is why Muller does this, if you look at the early Vedic hymns, you can see that they talk about certain forces. Agni is fire, Vainu is wind, Saraya is the sun. Now, eventually, these become deities and gods, but when they were written, they were actually describing sacred powers, sacred forces contained within nature. So this is the whole aspect of the kind of first stage, natural religion. Simply put, our first observation and interaction with nature, right? That first instinctual response that we have, that spark. The second is physical religion. Any ideas what we mean here?
The rituals and practices.
Okay, possibly rituals and practices. This physical religion still remains within the forces. The focus of physical religion is still basically the forces or nature. But what happens is we begin to kind of personify. We begin that process of personifying the elements. So in essence, what we're doing here is those, like we said in the other slide, we identify and then we personify. So in essence, those natural forces are deified. And ultimately, the reason for deifying or creating these gods is because of something Muller termed linguistic, basically, what was it again? Yeah, so linguistic kind of, can't even remember it now. I think it was personification, that's the word. God. Linguistic personification, right? So what does he mean that when we basically transferred the forces to deities, that there was this process of linguistic personification? What is linguistic personification? Can't stop saying it now.
It goes from the sea to an end.
Yeah, so in essence, what we had is, like I said, there was metaphor and literal description of the forces, right? The sun, the moon, whatever. But what actually we were doing when we first came across these natural phenomena, we used metaphorical descriptions. So the dawn smile, or the angry wind, or the angry storm. Now eventually, these metaphors of describing nature became deities. So in essence, the angry storm became the god Indra in Hindu mythology. So in essence, this is again showing that kind of interplay between that perception of nature and our utilization of language to describe that phenomenon that creates these kind of more tangible aspects of religion. Okay, so the third, are there any questions so far? So the third stage is the anthropological. Any ideas what we mean here? Yes, yeah, basically we humanize those gods. So this is basically the stage where the divine is conceived in human form and in human terms. So in essence, this is that whole anthropomorphic kind of being. We humanize the divine. So if we take our social reality, we experience a lot of things in our social reality. We're born, we live, we die, we marry, we have battles, we have wars, all these types of things. But what happens then is we project those into our gods. So the gods are born, they die, they marry, they have siblings, they have family structure, they have class structure, they have wars and so forth. So in essence, what we are doing is projecting our social reality into their lives, but also we project our physical construct into the gods. So this is why, from this point on, really the gods look like us. In Greek mythology, Norse mythology, Hindu mythology, the gods have humanized form. So we're projecting our physical and social reality into the god constructs that we create. So this is that whole process of humanizing. So Muller refers to this as a shift from the cosmological, which is that natural identification and personification of forces, to becoming more like a kind of moral religion. So here, what we mean by moral religion is the fact now that so before all of this, let's say, forces of nature were impersonal, non-intelligent entities. But now we're coming to this distinction between impersonal entities and personal entities. As soon as we create personal gods, what that means is we have a relationship with those gods, and those gods intervene in our affairs. So this again creates what? Ethical obligations for the religious practitioner. This creates sophisticated worship of these gods. This creates moral laws that we have to follow. So in essence, this is that period of humanizing religion, and this is where we, in some ways, there's a lot more social construction of religion during this anthropological kind of phase, right? I think it's the word. So that's a kind of key developmental period. So you can look at examples. So take, for example, the Bhagavad Gita. This is a dialogue between Lord Krishna and Arjuna. Lord Krishna descends from the heavens to speak with Arjuna, who's crippled by crisis. That whole dialogue is based on the divine agent giving guidance, moral guidance, philosophical guidance, religious guidance to a human agent. So this is again that anthropomorphic kind of period. Okay, any questions? Yes?
You know how we make gods therefore look like us? Is there any particular reason some cultures incorporate like animals as well? So like like Egyptian gods sort of have like a human body and like animal head. Is there any reason some cultures do that, some don't?
Social projection of the physical and the social reality. So we see animals, we see humans, we see different aspects. It's all a projection of what we see. So a lot of it, mutating them and so forth, but it's basically a projection of still what we see. Yeah, sorry.
Would it be right to Jake's point to say that the like certain human qualities are projected onto those animals, and so those animals become a symbol for like how humans are, or like human qualities, so like wisdom, particularly?
You could be strength in particular, so power. A lot of the sometimes more powerful animals are morphed due to their kind of belief of having a particular power. So it could be, all these mythologies differ. So the Egyptian and slightly Hindu philosophies or mythologies have an element of that. So Ganesh, a lot of his kind of symbolic traits are things like wisdom and characteristics supposedly of elements of elephants and so forth. So there is that component to it. So the next stage is the psychological. Now, what do we mean by this? Or what does Mullah mean by this? So essentially, Mullah believes that this is the final stage of religious development, and this is where religion becomes internalized. So now truth is not external, because everything up until this point, truth has been externalized outside of us. So we imbue nature, or we imbue gods, and that is all external worship, that is all external recognition. But now, with the psychological, we basically shift from imbuing the gods to suggesting that basically there is this kind of internal truth. So in essence, what is he alluding to here in terms of, let's say, a connection to Hinduism? So the big question is, what am I? It's about basically, truth is basically determined by a shift in our understanding of reality. So all of these other conceptions are quite dualistic conceptions of religion. There is a power, or there is a God. They exist external to us, sometimes outside of our physical universe. The psychological is to reject dualism and adopt a monistic conception that there is only a singular reality, a singular truth, and that's not external, that's internal. So then we talk about things like encountering experience and these things to kind of recognize and develop that relationship with truth. So everything from stage 1, 2, and 3 is very much external, while stage 4 is internal. It's about internal reflection of truth. So Mullah draws upon the whole idea of Brahman and Atman, that whole dichotomy that basically we are truth, we are the single connected part of the one. Are there any questions on that? Okay, just quickly to look at the phases of Hinduism, just to suggest how Mullah kind of came up with some of his ideas. So if we look at the development of Hinduism, I'm not going to go into detail here. Hinduism, as one of you mentioned, evolved through distinct stages. The first stage is a stage known as organic polytheism. This is where you had identification of forces and personification built possibly around utility, right? So simply put, you had in India, you had different tribes, and basically the gods that they created were fused to their particular utility, right? So in essence, that's how the different kind of gods were imbued and created. Now, what happens is these gods start off local, right? So they're a local god. Now, what happens in time, some of these gods become national. Now, how does that occur? So if this is local and is tied to utility, then how does it become a national god for everyone? How does maybe a sea person, a fisherman on the coast who worships Indra, specific to his utility, become a deity that everyone worships, disconnected from utility? They're successful. Okay, so basically, let's say you have one tribe, they worship Indra, and they become popular in terms of their crops start to grow, they become financially very strong. What happens then is other tribes start to copy or follow and adopt that god that is giving them success. So a local god starts local, built on individual utility, and then becomes a national deity if it becomes popular. And then you have creation of myth to elevate the god. Just because we're running out of time, what I'll do is, we won't go through the extensive aspects of Hinduism, but basically you have organic polytheism, which is that first reaction to nature. Then you have a stage known as this kind of monistic stage. So this is all quite dualistic. But what happens in Hindu philosophy is a monistic shift, where basically everything is reduced to the singular. So it's a monistic conception. All is one, right? And that becomes adopted, the whole concept of Brahman. But then, eventually, and this representation of Brahman is, he functions as an abstract truth. Brahman is impersonal. It's basically everything. So we are Brahman, the table is Brahman, there is a realization that we are all one, and basically that is Brahman, the one truth. Now, that then gives way again to this de-Brahmanized period where we again, Hindus adopt personalized gods again. Now why is that concept why is personal gods brought back, simply put? Yeah.
Because the gods first came out of utility, and then it seemed to shift towards a almost lack of utility, because it doesn't explain anything, it's just a universal, impersonal god.
Yeah, so simply put, the fisherman still has to fish, the farmer still has to farm. Their life still is built around utility. An abstract conception of the divine doesn't help them in their daily life. So there is a kind of resurgence of the personal gods functioning as a source of salvation, which is then bedded back to that kind of utility, because this is an external, transcendent, abstract truth that they can't connect to. Okay, let's move on. So the fourth theory that we need to look at is the theory proposed by Fraser, which relates to magic. Now, according to Fraser, what he suggests is that basically religion evolved from magic. So religion isn't perhaps first. Basically, we had some form of magic, and religion evolved out of magic. How is that the case? What does he mean that religion evolved out of magic? So we said, simply put, magic is about the early ancestors seeking to control and manipulate nature. There was a realization we are dependent on nature for our survival, to eat, to build shelter. So if we don't do those things, if we can't construct those things within nature, then we will die. So inevitably, we want to manipulate, we want to control nature for our human benefit. So controlling nature is the first thing that we try to do through magic. So for Fraser, magic comes first. And then we have religion, which is basically where we create divine entities that control nature. So we give control to those divine entities. They control nature. And then he suggests the last stage is science, where humans now control nature. We've gained mastery of the universe, and we know how basically things work, and so we control the physical universe. Now, what's interesting then, from this, so science obviously takes over the physical understanding of the physical universe, religion takes over understanding of the supernatural, and magic disappears, all right? It fades away, it goes. But for Fraser, he says actually magic still remains, but basically it remains as symbols in the modern day. It survives as symbols. We lose connection of the true meaning of why it was there. So if we go to the prehistoric period, magic was about preserving the spirit. All right? That's ultimately how it first came about. That we want to preserve the spirit or the soul. And that's where you see the Dungondani, where they try to extract the spirit out of a corpse and contain it. So it's about preserving, extracting spirit, right, or the soul. Now that's in the prehistoric period. How does magic survive as symbols in the modern? So it's basically about performing practices and having traditions, but disconnecting ourselves from the original kind of origin of it. So, for example, supposedly in Australia, a friend was telling me that on a Friday, everyone, irrespective of religion or whatever, generally eats fish and chips on a Friday. It's a tradition. You try to eat fish and chips on a Friday. And if you go back to early settlers, it relates back to basically a scarcity of certain meats that meant people had to have fish. And it was basically then the church of that time kind of endorsed it and so forth. So it became a religious thing to have fish. But that's in its origin. But now, when people go and eat fish and chips on a Friday, there's no connection to religion. So the original meaning has been lost, but we still carry it in symbols. Or you could think of things like Easter, things like eggs and the rabbit. These are all kind of remnants of paganism, right? So fertility gods in paganism. But we don't kind of connect it to that. It's been kind of changed. So what we see then, and what basically I think Fraser mentions is, if you look at an example that he gives the example of basically, I think it's the harvest rituals. So basically, certain communities and tribes perform a harvest festival or ritual where basically, when the harvest is coming to an end, the last corn is kept and preserved. And that last corn is perceived as sacred. So often what happens is that corn is then dressed in human form and also sacrificed at the end to kind of replicate the whole process of death and rebirth, because nature is built on this cycle of death and rebirth, and there is constant attempts to kind of replicate that. So in many ways that's what he's kind of asserting. Now, we'll try to explain that through the examples that Fraser uses. So Fraser, in his seminal piece, The Golden Bough, tries to understand the relationship between magic and religion. Now, what he tries to understand is, why is there commonality of myth? You have all these diverse societies, tribes, traditions, people. They're removed geographically, they're removed by time, yet there appears to be a commonality of the traditions. So take, for example, I know we've looked at India and we looked at Japan, right? These two countries are geographically separated. They have diverse and different language, culture, traditions. Their religions are quite different. Yet, if we look at the origin of their religion, we see that there is commonality, that you have those that worship similar types of gods on the coast and similar kind of gods in the mainland. So why is this? Why is there commonality then of the religion and the myth? What is the reason behind that? Yeah. Oh yeah, sorry.
So these similar circumstances and therefore similar utility, so you're going to get similar characteristics.
So if there is utility and religion comes from utility, then the gods that we create are going to be similar, and basically the myths that we are going to create are going to be similar. And this is what Fraser tries to argue. So he uses two examples. So he uses, and he talks about Nemi, the king of the wood. So this is basically, Nemi is a place near to Rome, and what he suggests is if you look at this story, I suppose I'll narrate the story quickly. So the king of the wood, simply put, is the story where you have this kind of forest, and to preserve the forest, to preserve the spirit of the forest, the king must be periodically sacrificed. And so what happens is this king is killed by an ex-slave. Now, this is a cycle because the ex-slave that kills the king becomes the king, and then he's replaced by another ex-slave. And this cycle repeats. And basically, to kill the sacred king, the only thing that can kill him is a branch from a sacred oak tree. Now, there are different variations of this. So some say that it's not actually an ex-slave, it's a priest. The priest is the one that becomes a king. And in a lot of tribal mythologies, the priest is a significant figure. Now, why is that? And obviously, when we talk about priests, we're not talking Judeo-Christian priest. We're talking actually about shamans. So shamans actually often become leaders and kings of tribes. Why? Yeah.
They have access to the divine.
Yeah, so they can manipulate nature, they can yield magic, they can harness the power of the supernatural and manipulate. So they are going to be key figures in any tribe or society. So, okay, so this is the story of the King of the Wood, right? But now Fraser says this story doesn't originate in ancient Rome because it's far too barbaric, and at the time the Romans were civilized. So he goes back and looks at other older mythologies, and he finds in Norse mythology the Balder the Beautiful, or the death of Balder the Beautiful. And so again, if we look at this story now quickly, in the story of Balder the Beautiful, what you have is Balder is supposedly immensely beautiful, and all the other gods are very jealous of him, except the goddess Frigg, who likes Balder, and she goes to all parts of the universe and enchants everything, all the objects in the universe, to not harm Balder. So he becomes impenetrable. Nothing can harm him because everything's been enchanted. But she forgets to enchant mistletoe. And Loki, the god of mischief, doesn't like Balder. So he goes far and wide and he finds mistletoe. And he breaks the branch of the mistletoe. In one other narration, to gain the mistletoe, Loki has to basically deposit his soul and gain the branch, right? So again, transference of the soul. So whatever the variant is, so he takes then this branch of mistletoe, comes back, and often the gods, for entertainment, because Balder was impenetrable, often gods would come and stab him with arrows and swords, and it was comedy, it was entertainment, because he couldn't die, he couldn't be penetrated. But then what Loki did is he gave the branch of mistletoe to a blind god, who then goes and he says, stab Balder, and he stabs him in the heart, killing Balder. So what we have then is two very similar stories. So what can we kind of infer from that? So these myths, which are far removed by time and geography, have similarity. So this, for Fraser, shows that basically elements of magic and the preserving of the soul and the spirit are key. So for example, just take mistletoe. There's some belief that mistletoe, if you go into a forest and the mistletoe that grows on a tree, it's there for the purpose that when the leaves fall, due to autumn and winter coming, the mistletoe is the thing that preserves the life essence, the soul of the tree. So it takes the soul of the tree, and then when the cycle finishes and we come back to spring, it releases the soul. So the mistletoe takes the soul of the tree, preserves the soul of the tree, and then returns it based on the cycle. So what we can see is a core aspect of this is that whole aspect of the transference and the preservance of basically the soul or the spirit. So if we take these examples, if we took a modern example, how would we relate those stories to, say, Superman? I'm not in any way an expert on Superman. How would we relate that? Is there similarity?
Yeah, that's his one weakness.
So if we look at it, as I understand it, obviously Superman is from Krypton, and when he comes to Earth, he's impenetrable. Nothing in our physical universe or Earth can destroy Superman. So in essence, what it is Krypton, though, is the source of his strength, the source of his power. Because he's from Krypton, that makes him powerful, impenetrable. It's the source of his power, but also it is the source of his demise and weakness, because it's the only thing, i.e. kryptonite, he can be killed by it, right? So again, there's an element of all of that. Okay, so let's move to the next theory. So if we look at Codrington, he basically suggests that the origin of early religion can be found in this substance manna. So he believes that manna and the use of it is the first kind of religious concept. Manna is this unseen, impersonal force, right? So in essence, what manna is, it inhabits living things, humans, animals, as well as it inhabits inanimate objects. So what you can do is you can take, say for example, an inanimate object like a rock, imbue it with manna, inject manna into it, and take that rock and help your crops grow. So it transfers the power of manna. So there is two aspects here then. So you have manna, which can be transmitted, and it can be inherited. So that's basically its power. So I suppose the best way to understand that, to make sense of what manna is to understand that there are two types of properties. I might have said this example in another class, but there are two types of properties. There is the intrinsic and there is the accidental. And you might remember an analogy to explain that, and this will explain manna. So let's say you want to boil a potato, right? So you have a potato, the potato is intrinsically cold, right? So you put it in water, water is intrinsically cold, you put it in the pan, and the pan is intrinsically cold, right? That's their properties. Now, how do you basically heat it? Well, you need fire. Now, fire is intrinsically, its intrinsic value is heat, all right? So, the intrinsic power of fire is heat. Now, when you put that fire on, the pan, the water, and the potato will become hot. But they're not intrinsically hot. They are borrowing the power of the fire. So they're borrowing that power, and they're basically using it and heating up the potato, right? As soon as you remove the fire, the potato, the water, the pan becomes cold. Now, what does that mean, and how does that relate to manna? Manna is this kind of substance, yeah? And what happens is you can take and borrow and imbue it into objects and things. So the intrinsic aspect of manna is a supernatural force. But you can then imbue it into other things and use it for your outcomes, for your kind of benefit. So in some ways, it's the intrinsicness of that life-giving energy. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so quickly, when we talk about magic and transference, A salient part of understanding magic is the manipulation of nature through the transference of spirit, transference of power. So the supernatural is transferred, directed to the physical universe for some kind of benefit, for some kind of outcome, right? So the whole issue of preserving spirit and the soul is important. So we see that in other religious systems. So take, for example, Hinduism. We have the transmigration of the soul. The soul is going into different physical entities. That's the transmigration. The spirit, the soul is coming out and being deposited into something else. And other faiths have this, like spirit possession and other things. Now, in the modern, is there illustrations of this? So if we take an example of a US professor, he basically did an experiment with his class. He came one day to class and he basically had this really nice jumper. And he said, look, does anyone want this jumper? And a lot of the students put up their hands. And then he said, oh, by the way, it belonged to, I can't remember which serial killer, but one of the serial killers. And then he said, do you still want it? And then a lot of the hands went down. So what he's trying to possibly suggest is that there is a perception amongst, maybe even in the modern, that evil can possibly be transferred, that it's this non-physical source. So basically people didn't want it because they felt it could be contaminated by that kind of evilness of the person who was a serial killer, and so they didn't want it. So there is an element, not necessarily saying it's the case, where even in the modern, sometimes we think evil can be transferred. Okay, moving now to Melon Nowinski. Now he is quite kind of a critical anthropologist who basically argues that there is this kind of relationship between magic and religion. So what he says is magic is to be expected and generally to be found whenever man comes to an unbridgeable gap, a hiatus in his knowledge or in his powers of practical control, and yet has to continue in his pursuit. What is he trying to say here? So you could have, let's say, a fisherman. He can build a boat. He can build a net. He might be able to understand the tide, when to go out, when to come back. But what can he not control is the weather. So if there is a storm, he won't eat. So in essence, there is an element that he can control, but there is that element he cannot control, which is things like the weather that will impact him. So this is where magic is utilized as a way to basically try to influence that situation. So in many ways, for Melon Nowinski and what he mentions here, is he suggests there is a distinction, therefore, between magic and religion. Magic is basically goal-orientated. It's done or performed for a tangible outcome. So if you've got sick people, well, then you need to heal them. You use magic. If your crops are dying, then you use magic to help your crops. So it's done for a tangible purpose outcome, for your material benefit. While religion, on the other hand, he suggests, is otherworldly. It's about you connecting to an afterlife. And so your actions are directed to that afterlife. It's about spiritual connection to that afterlife. So it's not in the same way goal-orientated. So the reason why perhaps a Muslim may pray, that is purely a spiritual act between him and his creator. It's not for material reward. So magic and religion, therefore, are different according to him. And this is why he kind of says that magic is, he describes magic as situational. So what does that mean? Early humans are navigating nature. They confront it constantly with challenges because nature is harsh. The weather can change and all these things. So they're always facing uncertainty and challenges, and magic is used as a way to manipulate and control it. So one of the functions of magic for Melon Nowinski is to actually reduce anxiety, that fear that we have of nature. So magic basically helps us in that way. according to him. So that basically resolves those, unbridgeable gaps. He talks about types of magic now. He says there's two types of magic. There's the magic of similarity and the magic of contact. The magic of similarity is literally known as the magic of likeness. So what you're trying to do is create a sympathetic reaction to the outcome you seek in the natural world. So a good example, Inuit tradition is when a woman wants to give birth in a home, what the other people will do is that they will open all the doors and all the windows because they want to create a similar effect for the woman, right? To make the child come out easily. So they open all the doors and windows. This is basically an example of trying to recreate the similar effect in nature that you want. Now, magic of contact is when you basically have two objects. You have one object, let's say crops, and you want to basically kind of fertilize your crops. So the example we gave where you imbue a rock with manna, once you take that rock and you touch that rock with the crops, that is the magic of contact. So that contact is creating transference between the manna, the supernatural, and the thing that you want to happen, the outcome of basically growing your crops. Are there any questions on that? Okay.